Welcome to episode 7 of the South Asia Democratic Forum podcast. The forum focuses on the democratic practices across and beyond South Asia. I'm your host for this episode, Sushmita Chaulagain. I'm an advocate based in Kathmandu, specializing in corporate law with a focus on FDI, and I'm currently working in Dolma Advisors Private Limited in Nepal, which is also part of Dolma Group, and I'm currently also working with our esteemed guest today, Honorary Professor Tim, OBE. Tim, could you introduce yourself?
With pleasure, Sushmita, and I'm delighted that we're in the same city, even if not in the same studio, because I'm currently in Kathmandu. Sure, look, I founded Dolma Fund Management, Dolma Group, to invest in Nepal well over 10 years ago. In fact, I've been involved in the country for well over 20 years. And the first 10 years of that was just our non-profit foundation. And since 2014, we've become one of the largest FDI investors in the country. And I'm really excited at this point where Nepal starts to generate surplus clean energy to export to India and Bangladesh, that we're very much part of the renewable energy sector as well as the other sectors that we invest in. So I hope that's what we're going to talk about today.
Thank you, Tim, for your introduction. And moving on to today's topic, which is unlocking green investment. And with Dolma's involvement in Nepal for over 10 years and being in prime investors in renewable resources, how do you think Nepal's foreign investment climate has evolved over the year from your experience, from your first-hand knowledge as well of the country?
I think it's doable. I think the domestic investment climate, particularly in the field of renewable energy, has matured dramatically, not just the developers, but the banks and the regulators and the stock exchange. I think that's very good. I think the country now needs to scale because its ambitions on climate change, on economic development, are beyond the capacity of domestic markets and groups like the World Bank and ADB in terms of government-to-government assistance. So I think for us, in Dolma, where we have a team of 20 people in Kathmandu managing approvals from government, bureaucratic delays, and of course managing the funds and the compliance with our investors and regulators, I think that's fine. But what Nepal needs to do now is create a level playing field. So if I'm an investor from London or Singapore, and I just want to commit capital without having a team on the ground, I'm on a level playing field with groups like Dolma, which are just dedicated to Nepal. I think that's got to be the goal of government, to create that level playing field.
So to give a brief background on the topic, Nepal is at the turning point when it comes to the energy and investment. The country definitely has an immense renewable energy potential, particularly in hydropower as well as solar energy. However, despite this, there has been issues where the country has not been able to fully harness the resources. And Nepal's journey with foreign direct investment began as early as the 1980s, which gained the momentum with the 1990s economic liberalization, and there was introduction of the Foreign Investment and Technology Act of 1989, which was a pivotal moment for foreign investment in Nepal. Now that act has been replaced by the 2019 Foreign Investment and Technology Transfer Act, which has also been recently amended, which has particularly included provision about the investment of non-resident of Nepal and alternative investment fund. Nepal reported 0.07 billion in FDI in 2023, which is a 12.8% increase from 2022. There's still requirement of increment to meet the 46.5 billion energy roadmap set by the government, which is to be met by the government by 2035. So with your experience of over about 10 years in Nepal with Dolma Group and then being the largest FDI, one of the largest FDI investor in Nepal, how do you think the Nepal's investment climate has evolved, and what has the recent policy changes shaped the renewable energy sector in Nepal?
Great. Well, thank you, Sushmita. As you say, we've been investing in Nepal for over 10 years. Actually, I've been working in some form or another in Nepal for over 20 years. The first 10 was with our non-profit Dolma Foundation, which continues, and the last 10 is in private sector FDI. So I'd like to, if we cast our mind back 20 years, the country was in civil conflict. And that was a situation where it is almost impossible to attract foreign investment. But the good thing is that the peace process, which finished in 2006, which was agreed, has been extremely successful. And there's been no return to violence. So by 2011-12, I started to get the confidence that Nepal could really raise private sector and deploy private sector capital, and it was a sufficiently stable environment. And I think that political stability and democratic freedoms have continued with the new constitution. So it puts Nepal now at a situation where it has the incredible natural resources of the Himalayas and its plains. Now, of course, at the moment, Nepal is suffering from climate change. It's one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. And so we're seeing the melting of the glaciers, the rapid melting of the glaciers affect not just Nepal, of course, but the 600 million people in bordering Indian states and Bangladesh downstream from the glaciers and the rivers. So I think we're more excited than ever to get behind Nepal's new $46.5 billion energy roadmap to really build out more of that natural resource potential through hydropower and solar, to reduce emissions, to reduce pollutants, to give bordering countries the opportunity to retire thermal power plants. And we're doing everything we can to support that, including raising a new fund just for renewable energy and issuing the first international green bonds for Nepal. So I'll stop there in summary. And we'll get into more detail. I'll then perhaps answer your real question, which was about the investment climate.
Thank you, Tim, for a very insightful answer. As you said that Nepal is in a very much of a center of the climate change, the glaciers are melting, and as you are also in Kathmandu and I'm also in Kathmandu, and we've seen the change firsthand. The snow-capped mountain, the beautiful snow-capped mountains now seem to have lesser to no snows at all, and which is also, I think, worsened by the black carbon deposits and the rising temperature. In this scenario, how do you think Nepal would be a center for the renewable energy sector and contribute to the regional climate resilience in this day and age?
Well, I think Nepal has earned its right to have negotiated the 10,000 megawatt export agreement to India and to start exporting power through that little strip of India to Bangladesh. And that's because of the success of the independent power producers. So some 30 plus years ago, the government started to give concessions in the form of power purchase agreements to private sector companies to build what's been until now mostly hydropower plants. And that model has become very successful, not just because of the pioneering and risk-taking spirit of those promoters, but also because of the predictable ecosystem that's been built around that. And that includes the Nepal Electricity Authority that buys the power. It includes the regulatory bodies like the Electricity Regulatory Commission, the Department of Electricity Development. It includes the banking sector, which has come to understand and embrace renewable energy. And it includes the stock exchange, which gives such IPPs a path to list and ultimately to exit. So I think relative to the development of Nepal as an economy, the renewable energy ecosystem is far more mature. And having participated in that through both hydro and solar for the last 10 years, we're ready to increase our commitment and participate in this journey of Nepal adding capacity beyond its own requirements to help fuel India and Bangladesh, parts of India and Bangladesh, with renewable energy. So I think it's a very exciting moment, and you've got the combination of the Indian export potential, the Bangladesh export potential, this new energy roadmap, and of course Nepal's first sovereign credit rating, which came in at BB minus, which is very positive.
Tim, you mentioned about solar power as well. While hydro is a much discussed about topic in Nepal and it generates about 1500 megawatt through independent power producers, while solar remains only at about 33 megawatt. And however, the fact shows that Nepal gets about 300 sunny days annually, which makes it a very centrally located or favorable climate for solar energy. So with this fact, what do you think, what policies or incentive can encourage a large scale solar investment alongside hydropower in Nepal?
Well, there's been a huge increase recently in the number of licenses given out for solar power. And if you look at the potential of renewable energy capacity, there's actually more potential for solar power because of that very high solar radiation than there is for hydropower. But it's early days. We invested in the first on-grid solar IPP back in about 2018-19. The government has just issued bids and completed that process for over 900 megawatts, of which that same company won a 90 megawatt license. So you can see how Nepal is increasing. I think its target is to maintain solar at about 10 to 20% of the total grid capacity, and it's on course to do that. It's also developed its bidding mechanism and its price structure, which has been very helpful. So the solar market is becoming more mature.
Also, Tim, you mentioned about the ecosystem of this whole thing. So, how do you think the ecosystem would come into play for the emerging solar energy, tapping of the emerging solar energy, as well as hydro for Nepal as a renewable energy hub for the region?
Well, I think the energy markets here they stand out. Nepal obviously is a least developed country. It's a very poor country. From a GDP per capita perspective, it has very poor infrastructure. But this hard work by many groups of private and public collaborators over the last 30 years to create this environment and confidence in IPPs, to develop 30 years of confidence that the NEA will pay its bills, which it does do very much on time. So the industry as a whole has built up a confidence. I don't want to pretend this is a developed market. The pricing of PPAs is very simple. It's sort of a rack rate. But if you like, that allows developers and investors like us to reverse engineer projects and see if it will create enough returns to make it worth investing. So it's not sophisticated, but I think it's grown up, and relative to other industries which we invest in, certainly this is a more mature ecosystem. I think the issue is going to come now with ambitious targets, which the government should be applauded for. I don't think we should ever criticize the government for not being ambitious. But of course, in seeking to build 28,000 megawatts in order to fulfill this domestic and export demand, there is not sufficient capacity in domestic investment markets, either in equity or debt. So a significant amount of that $46 billion will need to come from FDI. And that's where I think the investment climate needs to develop to be more welcoming to foreign investors.
Thank you, Tim, for putting it so simply for all our listeners and viewers. As you also mentioned about the credit rating and how it is a good thing for Nepal, could you elaborate a little bit more on that for our listeners?
Of course. So generally, almost all countries have a credit rating. Many have issued sovereign bonds in the international market. Nepal hasn't done that yet. But what this allows investors to do is gain an understanding of how risky credit to the country, debt to the country may be. So we are not surprised by a BB minus. To give you an example, what's considered investment grade, where many of the largest investment funds in the world are allowed to invest, the ones that manage our pensions, for example. Triple B minus is a rating which is investment grade, and that's, for example, India's sovereign credit rating. So double B minus is only 2 notches below that. Now, I think Nepal hasn't done a very good job at selling itself. So we've known for a long time, I'm not pretending investing in Nepal is not difficult and is not risky, of course it is, but relative to the perception to the outside world, I think it's less risky. When I tell people the Nepal Electricity Authority has never defaulted in 30 years, they're surprised. When I tell people that public debt to GDP is only 40-something%, people certainly in Western European countries where it's more like 100 are quite jealous. So, the macroeconomic stability is there, so it doesn't surprise us that we got a relatively high rating. So I think this is a really positive sign in attracting the FDI that Nepal needs.
Very simply put, Professor Tim, thank you so much for your insights. You also mentioned while you were explaining that Nepal has signed a major energy export agreement with India as well as Bangladesh. So, in line with this, there is also like a global climate change, which we discussed, and this also threatens the water security and energy stability across South Asia, right? And this makes green investment and renewable energy not just an economic opportunity, but also a necessity for climate resilience in the region. And I also saw an interview of yours in which you mentioned renewable energy, how Dolma had worked in renewable energy. And with your experience, could you also elaborate on how these deals can enhance the regional cooperation and Nepal's role as a renewable energy hub for the region?
Well, absolutely. It's a necessity. Of course, if Nepal were to expand to export, it would be a dramatic boost to Nepal's economic development just because of the increase in exports. But quite apart from the economic development, the climate change risk that it mitigates is enormous. So I think I'll just go into that for a minute because it's quite specific and regional. The bordering states of India and Bangladesh are largely thermal and coal-fired power. And for example, in Uttar Pradesh, just over the border in India, there's a 3,000 megawatt coal-fired power plant. Now, what's happening, of course, those plants and other polluters and industries and dirty vehicles and people burning firewood are, of course, emitting greenhouse gases, which is a global phenomenon, and as we all know, global temperatures are warming. But there's another additional and more short-term problem, specifically in the Himalayas, and that is the problem of black carbon, or soot, which is belched out of, for example, coal-fired power stations, and quite simply darkens the surface of the ice and snow, which, of course, increases the absorption of heat and increases the speed at which the glaciers are melting. And this is thought to account for about 30% of the speed of glacial melt. So actually this is a short-term issue, and what I mean by that is, let's say we woke up tomorrow and that 28,000 megawatts was on the grid, and Nepal was exporting 10,000 of it to India, who could retire that 3,000 megawatt power station, and to Bangladesh, who could do similar things. Well, that would mean a significantly less output of black carbon. Therefore, and if you just take one winter's snowfall, and that problem has gone away. Whereas, of course, CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions would take decades to actually reduce the global temperature. So there is something we can do about this. We have the natural resources within the region, much of them in the Himalayas of Nepal. And you're absolutely right. It's a complete necessity that we develop Nepal's and export Nepal's renewable energy potential.
As we both agree, it is a necessity to, have Nepal's renewable energy and natural resources be utilized. And you also emphasized on the energy roadmap of the government, which is 46 billion approximately. So how could a private sector and foreign direct investment particularly be involved to assist the government to achieve this roadmap, or to be the forefront for Nepal government to achieve this roadmap, and be the regional hearts for climate, for the resilience against the climate change, and to make FDI one of the major source of revenue for government of Nepal as well?
I think that is the most important question. Is Nepal now needs a level of investment which it couldn't possibly fulfill domestically. And when I talk about the ecosystem being relatively mature, I'm talking about the ecosystem largely for domestic investors and domestic lenders. So what now Nepal needs to do is scale its investment climate and be ready for foreign direct investment. And I think what you start that journey with development finance institutions, which Nepal has already done. As you know, Sushmita, most of our investors are development finance institutions. That means these are private sector institutional investors, but they're backed by governments or multilateral development banks, and they can take a little more risk than, say, a large pension fund or a global infrastructure fund based in London or New York. And so with our investors, the likes of IFC, FMO, BII, who are also investing directly in energy and other sectors in Nepal through both equity and debt, we have some investments which for the first time could give Nepal a track record. And I think that's what Nepal is missing in order to go for bigger institutional investors, is a track record of money put into the country at risk and repatriated from the country, achieving a level of return which is sufficient to compensate investors' perception of the risk. So what is that? Well, if it's equity, and I don't know these numbers, I'm making them up, but if I was an investor in India, I might require 14 or 15% return on the US dollar for an equity risk in a renewable energy plant. Again, I don't know if that's the real number, but if that is the number, then Nepal has to be a few percentage points higher than that, because obviously Nepal is far less tested and seen as far more risky than India. So I think the DFI money, both through the different Dolma impact funds and directly, are a source of great importance. And I think what the government could be doing is making things as easy and as smooth as possible. It's prepared to take commercial risks. Some investments succeed, some investments don't succeed. But I think where the risk becomes much more difficult is where the government's changing hands very often. There's bureaucratic delays, there's uncertainty about legal frameworks. Where that becomes the risk, it becomes more troubling. So I think working in partnership between investors like us and our DFI partners and the government to make that experience as smooth as possible, and to allow those investors to post returns and tell the world about it. It's possible to help participate in this regional climate change revolution out of Nepal and to not put your money at unreasonable risk and to expect a reasonable return for that risk. So I think there's still work to be done for the investment climate to scale up to the level of attracting the sort of $10 to $20 billion in FDI that's going to be required. At the moment, FDI levels are very small. I think the last recorded amount was 43 million in a year. So to get to 20 billion, you've got to go up by sort of 50 times. And that's where work on the investment climate is so important.
While we're still on the investment topic, and you also explained and touched a little on the topic of how much investment we had in 2023 versus the energy roadmap requirement, and also how the government could facilitate, and maybe how there could be an easier roadmap for the investors to invest in and take a risk for a country like Nepal where it is untested maybe. So how could the government or even the private sectors be more open or more welcoming towards foreign investment and DFIs in particular?
Well, I think the first area is to focus on the least amount of bureaucratic hurdles and just make that path. Let investors take the risk, but don't add to that risk by bureaucratic delays. But that's not the only thing that investors are worried about. I think also very big factors that would affect investment decisions from foreign investors would be the environmental and social governance climate. So as we know, as a fund manager, we have a whole team dedicated to compliance with international ESG standards. And this, by the way, becomes extremely important with infrastructure projects like hydro or solar, where it might force people to move because of that. It might affect locally endangered species, particularly fish. So each project has to have a mitigation plan. I'll give one example. One of our hydropower projects, Setikola, has recently completed a resettlement plan for a group of people who were living illegally river, and they were mining the stones from that river. But they were still seen as valid community stakeholders. And so what we did with the project was rebuilt their homes further up the hill, so they were safe from any potential flooding. And now they live in a much better community because of that hydro. The risk that even before the hydro plant, they were being flooded frequently. Now, this is obviously not upheld or required under Nepal law, but international institutional investors are very concerned about their reputations. They're very concerned about the effects of infrastructure development on local communities and environmental ecosystems. So I think there's not sufficient awareness, whether that's among the promoters and developers or the banks, or even the regulators, of the kind of levels. We also see a lack of capacity when we're trying to hire for these roles in our portfolio companies. So I think that's another big area. I think a third area, and it's related to ESG, is the understanding of whole river basin studies. So at the moment, licenses are given out on an opportunistic basis. The rivers and the cumulative impact assessments that should be done on entire river systems haven't been done, or I haven't seen them at a national level. So really you don't get the sense of a ecological plan based on a river basin. So because of that, as an individual developer, that we can obviously assess the environmental impact that one project is going to have. But it's very hard to assess the cumulative impact of all of the, let's say, hydro plants on a particular river. And so I think the government really needs to develop that to make sure that investors feel comfortable. They're not actually, in trying to solve a problem, they're not just creating an even bigger problem without even knowing about it. So I would say that those are the three areas which are most important. Help the current investors post a successful track record through streamlining bureaucracy. Number two, improve environmental and social governance standards and the capacity to implement them within Nepal. And three, work on and publish a river basin study throughout Nepal's Himalayas to make sure that people are sure they're not participating in the problem and not the solution.
One thing you put really interestingly is that we are working on a solution and not creating more problem, relating that with the study of river basins in Nepal, and Nepal being a country with so many fast-flowing rivers and energy that we could tap in from those rivers, being hydros that Dolma is currently working on as well. What would you say from your experience could be the solution, creating environment rather than a problem creating environment, not only for Nepal but for the region as a whole?
For the region as a whole, I know there's similar issues in parts of India and Bangladesh, which really make up the majority. I mean, if you add the populations, even of the northeast of India, the bordering states, I think is over 400 million, 500 million. Bangladesh is, I think, nearly 200 million. So just there, immediate downstream, you have the poorest areas of India, the most climate vulnerable areas of India, and also they will suffer the same problems, those parts of India and Bangladesh, with ESG, with the ability to understand, mitigate, and be more climate resilient in those areas as they experience more and more floods and climate events. So I think this is a regional play. I think we should take it country by country, and I do know that in Nepal there's been lots of work with the Nepal Banking Association, the private sector body of banks, to further train and build capacity in ESG. There has been FMO's investment in NMB Bank, which has raised NMB's bank's capacity to monitor and implement ESG. And that, and also in partnership with Invest for Impact Nepal, a group which is funded by DFIs and foreign donors to generally increase capacity and further FDI in Nepal. And they've been working on improving ESG standards throughout Nepal. So ESG for us or for international investors is not a nice to have, it's a must have. And I think it's an area that Nepal needs some help on catching up, and I can see that help well underway.
As Nepal moves towards its energy and sustainability goals, attracting the right investments and policies will be crucial. Thank you, Professor Tim, for sharing your insights. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode of South Asia Democratic Forum podcast. Stay engaged, stay informed, and we'll see you next time.